I regret I shall not be speaking in Danish, but I think if I tried, you would regret it. What I want to talk about is family businesses, to some extent, mainly in France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. I only know a little bit about Denmark, and I'll briefly refer to it, but not very much. I think it's fair to say that if you listen to people in the United Kingdom and the United States in what I would call the Anglo-Saxon capital markets, you get an impression that the Anglo-Saxon type of capital markets are the dominant ones. In fact, they're relatively unusual. Their ownership is dispersed. On the contrary, concentrated ownership and family ownership is the norm rather than the exception. In most of continental Europe, Scandinavia, and in Asia, family ownership is dominant. It is widely dispersed in only 3 capital markets, the UK, US, and Japan. Where it is concentrated, families make up an important part of that concentrated ownership. To give you an example, there's a typographical error. Almost 50% of the top Italian companies are controlled by families. And I just want to give you a few statistics from 4 countries, including Italy, where we look at the ownership of the top 1,000 companies. The top 1,000, irrespective of whether it's private or whether it's listed. And it's interesting that in Italy, France, and Germany, at least a third to almost a half of companies in the top 1,000 are family controlled. By family controlled, I mean that the family shareholders have at least a quarter of the equity. Notice in the UK, it's about 20%. However, that 20% is an exaggeration. Because of that 20%, about 9% are foreign families, like the Indian company Tata or the American company Ford. When you take away foreign families, you find out that British families control maybe 11 to 12% of those top 1,000 companies. Why have UK and to some extent American regulatory authorities, British and American institutions, on the whole, they are skeptical of large block holders, including families, particularly in the UK. We don't really like large block holders. We distrust large block holders. And behind this distrust or skepticism is the idea of a level playing field. Now, to understand a level playing field, you really have to understand the game of cricket. I thought of asking how many people in this room play cricket, but I think I know the answer. Cricket is all about fair play. And that underlies the UK skepticism about large block holders. There is a feeling in the UK that large block holders benefit at the expense of the minority. We don't like dual-class shares. We like pyramids even less. In 1965, about 13% of UK-listed companies had dual-class shares. That is, voting shares, non-voting shares. Today, you can't find 5. Why? Because institutions and the stock exchange said to companies with dual-class shares, if you keep them, you can't raise new equity capital. We will not subscribe to new equity capital. And therefore, you have the decline and virtual disappearance of dual-class shares. We make it very difficult for companies which have large controlling blocks or who wish to retain control through dual-class shares. The basis of this is a feeling that large block holders misappropriate at the expense of minorities. And underlying this is the concept of, in my view, fairness rather than economic efficiency. Let me say this, that people often think that the block holder has private benefits of control. This is what economists call private benefits of control. And they refer to private benefits as though they're always negative. Let me give you some examples. That is, the block holder pays themselves excessive salaries. They have below-market transactions. And there are related party transactions which are not at arm's length. That succession is based on blood, not ability. However, there are positive private benefits of the block holder, and these are not stressed. That is, the block holder has control of the company, monitors the company, and ensures that it performs well. Compare that to the British company, where nobody controls the company, except for the managers. And the consequence is there are large agency costs to the UK capital market. Agency costs in respect of that the managers are not the owners, they are the agents. And as a consequence, they run the company less efficiently. Family companies tend to be more long-termist because of succession. Maybe there's more trust, more commitment. And kinship is regarded as having value. That is, family succession is a form of pre-commitment, if you like, is a form of trust. So in the economic literature, private benefits is stressed as something negative, and I think this is a mistake. What explains the view of economists to focus on the negative side of private benefits arising from blockholder control? There is a strong, what I would call, law and finance view. The law and finance view can be traced to four economists, Laporta, Schleifer, and Vishny, mainly at Harvard. And their view is the following. Concentrated ownership is the result of poor investor protection. Where you see concentrated ownership, you will see poor investor protection, and you will see small stock markets. Large stock markets are the result of high investor protection, where small shareholders are willing to invest. So the UK stock markets, the capital markets for the UK, US have prospered because we have high investor protection, and we have dispersed ownership because small investors are willing to invest because they know they are protected against misappropriation. They go further, actually. They not only talk about high investor protection, but they talk about a common law legal system, which they regard as very important to investor protection. This law and finance view, which connects investor protection to dispersion of ownership, to stock market performance, is a view that prevails in regulatory circles. I think the European Union has kind of adopted this view. And even if governments like Denmark or in Scandinavia generally would like to retain block and family ownership, the drift in Europe through the Commission, I think, is more towards a UK type of capital market. The real question is, are UK markets more efficient than those continental European markets which have strong family or block ownership? And I think the answer is far from obvious. I want to show you some evidence that the law and finance people would put up to back up their view that concentrated ownership on the whole is bad. These are voting premiums in a number of countries. You will not see Scandinavia on these tables, but you will in a few minutes. You'll be patient. And what is the bottom line? Dual class shares, voting shares, stand at large premiums to non-voting shares. And the law and finance view is that these premiums reflect private benefits. That is, the large stockholder gains at the expense of the non-voting or smaller shareholder. In countries like the UK and US, those voting premiums are smaller. There is another study which looks at block premiums. These are the prices at which block holders sell their blocks, and this compares it to the prices of shares that trade outside the block. So I sell my block for 120, the prices of the other shares are 100, my block premium is 20%. Why do I want 20%? Because of private benefits. I need you to compensate me for the loss of private benefits when I give up my block. So this is another example of where countries with concentrated ownership tend to sell at premiums because of private benefits of control. Notice the UK and US has relatively low private benefits. The explanation for these voting premiums and block premiums is that they reflect private benefits and misappropriation, or private benefits at the expense of the minority. This is probably the most famous textbook in finance. These private benefits of control seem to be much larger in some countries than others. In the United States, the premium that an investor needs to pay is only 2% of firm value, but in Italy it is 29%, and in Mexico it's 36%. It appears that in these two countries, majority investors are able to secure large private benefits, and they do so at the expense of the minority. And this is just another illustration of the connection. Here you see that the UK and US have relatively large private stock markets. That is, this is the market capitalization of the stock market over GDP. It's very large in the UK and US, the block premiums are very low, and concentrated ownership is low. In Italy and Germany, stock markets are small, block premiums are larger, and ownership concentration is greater. That is the connection. I did promise you that I would put up Scandinavia. I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait a moment. I just want to... I really love going to Italy, so this is why I put up so many graphs of Italy. I want to show you one more thing. Not only do the British not like block ownership, what we like even more, or what we dislike even more, is pyramidal ownership. This is a very interesting pyramid. It's a pyramid of the Tronchetti family in Italy and their control of Telecom Italia. And notice, they have control or virtual control of all the intermediary companies down to Telecom Italia. Either they own 50% of the shares about, or they have a voting syndicate, or in the case of Telecom Italia, which is widely dispersed, they have a block of 18%. But what is their cash flow ownership in Telecom Italia? They may have voting control, but their cash flow ownership is less than 1%. It is 0.7%. Again, this is an example, if you like, of what the British would call not a level playing field. And they regard it as creating private benefits of control which come from minority shareholders. At last, Scandinavia. You remember those slides where I put up voting premiums for a series of countries? It's kind of interesting that in the same paper for Scandinavia, the voting premiums are extremely low. Let's look at the block premiums. They're also very low. Now, why is this important? Because the UK would have us believe, and to some extent the Americans, that you have two choices of capital markets. You can either have a concentrated capital market with low investor protection, high private benefits, or you can, if you like, enter paradise and have a UK-style capital market with dispersed ownership and high investor protection. And I believe that is incorrect. You can have a market dominated by families, by blocks, and providing you have regulation and a culture which prohibits misappropriation, you will have much lower private benefits and a more thriving capital market. Is it possible to have a market with concentrated ownership, relatively high investor protection, and low private benefits? The answer is yes, and I think Scandinavia is an example of that capital market. I am, as you can perhaps perceive, somewhat critical of the UK capital markets. And The Economist ran an article in 2012, and a very interesting one, where they showed, or rather they cited evidence, that the UK capital stock markets had contracted over the recent decade and a half. Between 1997 and 2012, the number of listed companies in the United States dropped 38%, and in Britain by 48%. There has been a contraction, and a major contraction, of the number of listed companies. To some extent, this reflects the rise of private equity, which has gradually taken an increasing number of companies private. What is the explanation of this decline in the number of listed companies in the two main stock markets? One explanation, and I'm here quoting from the title of Michael Jensen's article in the Harvard Business Review in 1987, and it was entitled "The Eclipse of the Public Corporation." And Michael Jensen's view was that public corporations would decline. They would decline because the public corporation, there was a lack of alignment between managers and owners. And the consequence of this was large agency costs. This is being put very well by Lord Miners, a former minister of the city, who described British companies as ownerless corporations. That is, you and I have shares in British companies, but we never vote, we never attend the annual general meeting. The company is in the hands of managers who are not owners, and the consequence is high agency costs. It may be that there's an alternative. I've painted this in a very gloomy light, this eclipse of the public corporation. It may be that we should not think of our capital markets as being public or private anymore. There is a blurring between public and private. Private companies can access the capital markets in a way they could not 20 years ago. So to talk about just the public capital markets, maybe we should just talk about the capital markets. This distinction between private and public is no longer quite so helpful. But suffice it to say, UK stock markets have been, to some extent, in decline. Let me summarize, if you like, the main thrust of what I'm saying. There is no question in the UK we have low private benefits of control. We have strict regulation which prevents misappropriation, which prevents discrimination against minorities. We have independent boards which also are helpful in trying to reduce agency costs. But the agency costs of ownerless corporations is still very high in the UK. It is high because ownership is fragmented and owners do not exercise control. In Italy, there are high private benefits. There are no agency costs. Families are in control. But there is no question that the regulatory system is sufficiently loose that some of those private benefits, at least, are at the expense of a minority. I would point out that in Scandinavia, you have, maybe because of regulation, maybe because of culture, those private benefits are a lot lower. And you may have struck a better balance between concentrated ownership on the one hand, mainly by families or by trusts, and on the other hand, low private benefits. If you like, the alternative to the Italian stock market, and I want to stress, God may not I have to say, God may not be Roman Catholic, but I'm sure God is Italian because it's such a beautiful country. But nevertheless, there are large private benefits and control, and to some extent, they're at the expense of minorities. Now, in these last few minutes, I want to discuss a little bit about a study I've done. In fact, we've done a study on family ownership in 27 countries, but we have focused on 4 countries: France, Germany, Italy, and the UK. And basically, we are investigating what I would call a life cycle view. What we think about is in the UK, families grow, they need capital, they list on the stock market, and then they sell out. This is the life cycle view attributed to a great economist, Alfred Chandler. An alternative view is that countries do not follow a life cycle, that families do not sell out. And we would expect France, Germany, and Italy to follow that alternative path. The really interesting question is, why have families persisted in France, Germany, and Italy, and not in the UK? And do we care? That's really the interesting question. As I've hinted to you, we look at the top 1,000 companies in each country. By the top 1,000, we look at it by turnover, by sales turnover. We don't care whether it's private or public. And what we do is we look at these companies in 1996, and we track them over 10 years to 2006 to see what happens to them. And I don't have too much time, so I'm going to talk about the main results. In the UK, we have relatively modest family ownership. In fact, I would say it's very little. 12% of the top 1,000 are controlled by domestic families. It's more like a third to a half on the continent. Family firms follow a life cycle in the UK. I'm going to show you that in a moment. They grow, they list, they sell out. Much less so on the continent. Now, there is one very interesting distinction between UK families and continental families. In the UK, family-controlled companies are concentrated in industries that do not raise external capital. That is, where an industry needs to raise external capital, you will not find UK families. They're in those industries that don't need external capital. In contrast, in France, Germany, and Italy, family ownership is spread across all industries, unrelated to the need for external capital. And this, I think, is very important. That is, the British capital system is focused on listed companies far more than on private companies. Whereas in Italy, in France, and Germany, the capital markets are focused on supplying capital to private as well as listed companies, and those with family ownership, etc. So the capital market in the UK is, I think, far too focused on listed companies, on the public companies, rather than on the private companies. It's interesting that when we look at the profitability of family firms versus non-family firms, they tend to have at least as high profitability, if not a little bit higher. And that is interesting because you might have thought that families, they consume private benefits. They appoint their kids to succeed them. And by the way, there's a very interesting study by an organizational behaviorist who looks at the IQ of family firms. This is not going to be very popular with you. Looks at the IQ of family firms versus non-family firms. And he finds that the family ownership, the IQ of family owners is lower than that of non-families. Now, this should not be a surprise to you because if you fish from a smaller pool, you're going to get a low IQ. Now, here is a little better news that is going to stop you throwing me out now. The better news is that this OB man looked at their personal skills and leadership skills and found them to be superior to those in the non-family firms. So, if you like, maybe a little lower IQ, maybe higher leadership and personal skills. I haven't made that up, by the way. But what I think is so interesting is that you might think that private benefits should reduce the profitability of family firms below that of the non-family. In fact, it does not do so. You might say that this profitability is helped by dual-class shares and pyramids, and we do not find that to be the case. It's perhaps obvious now that in the UK, the stock markets are far more important than they are than on the continent. Of those 1,000 firms, about 28% are listed. Compare that to Italy, where the statistics are less than a third. France is about half that of the UK, and so is Germany. I want to just graphically describe why family, if you like, the stability or lack of stability of family ownership. In these 4 graphs, I'm going to show you what happens to families in 1996 and how they evolved 10 years later. So here are 235 German firms. They're family firms. They're listed in 1996. And what happens to them 10 years later? And the answer is, for 53%, they remain family controlled. Remember what I mean by family controlled? The family has at least 25% of the equity. In the case of 40%, they're taken over by non-family companies. And in 7% of cases, the ownership is sold out and becomes fragmented. Think of that figure of 53%. In France, it's 59%. That is, 59% remain family-controlled 10 years later. 35%, if you like, die through takeover, and 10% become widely held. In Italy, the number who remain family-controlled is even higher. 70%, 71% of Italian families 10 years later remain family-controlled. 22% are subject to a takeover, and 6% become widely held. So you can see that there's relative stability, not great stability, but relative stability. Now look at the UK. Only 30% of UK companies remain family-controlled. 42% are taken over, and 28% the family sells out and the ownership becomes fragmented. That gives you an idea about the evolution of ownership in these 4 countries. Now, I've got 3 minutes left, and I want to spend 3 minutes on trying to draw these thoughts together. How should family-dominated capital markets evolve? What should governments do? In my view, the greatest threat to family ownership are the takeover markets. Private equity and takeovers will be going to German families and encouraging them to sell out. And one of their arguments is that the cost of capital of a family-controlled firm is inevitably higher than the equivalent dispersed firm, or firm with dispersed ownership. Why? Because the family-controlled firm is undiversified. Its shareholders are undiversified. And the consequence of that is it has a higher cost of capital. Do I worry in the UK about the low proportion of companies with family control? The answer is yes. And in about 2 months, I'll be holding a conference in London, which is to try and get this discrimination against family ownership in our listed market reversed. I think we want a diverse capital market where family ownership can flourish alongside, if you like, dispersed ownership. Should we be worried on the continent about the concentration of family ownership? As such, I don't think we should be worried in principle. What we should be worried that regulation allows block holders sometimes to misappropriate from the minority. That is, I think Italy is an example where regulation is not tough enough to prevent the majority misappropriating from the minority. I negative private benefits are too large, I think, in Italy. And I think, to be fair, the Italian government is addressing that problem. But the alternative is not the UK type of ownership model. The alternative is to improve regulation and to develop a culture where family ownership can flourish, but not at the expense of the minority. Should there be a bias for or against companies with large stockholders, particularly families? I think the answer is no. You know, when Mr. Murdoch, I'm talking about Mr. Murdoch Sr., was the CEO of his company, and he decided to step down, he had to appoint a committee to scour the world to look for the best person to succeed him. And by chance, or by the divine hand, they found Mr. Murdoch's son as the best person to succeed him. Now, this reflects a charade, but it also reflects that kinship and family succession is not valued. In my view, if you force families, if you like to go out, you force them to go outside the family, they might as well sell out. They might as well sell the family business and invest in property or invest in diversified securities. You have to, if you like, you have to value kinship, you have to value family succession if you will want families to persist. Should we have a bias against families? I think it's apparent that I think that is not appropriate. I think it's an interesting question. Should you have a bias for family ownership? Especially given that the cost of capital of family companies is higher than the equivalent non-family companies which has dispersed ownership. And that, I think, is an interesting question and one that we should think about. From a UK perspective, are we stuck with the landscape of ownership that we have arrived at? And you know, for those of you who kind of read Darwin, you kind of evolve and the strong survive and the weak go to the wall. It's an interesting question. Has the UK gone on an ownership path which is less competitive than other capital markets? And that, I think, is a concern. And can we reverse that? I would seriously think about reversing the discrimination against block ownership, particularly against family ownership. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, is this too simplistic a metaphor to use for summing up what you're saying about ownership? Ownership, if you compare it to a toolbox, you have a spanner, you have a hammer, you have a screwdriver. Which is the better tool? Doesn't make sense, depends on the job that needs to get done. And to have a dispersed possibility of different types of ownership is in some a positive for any economy.
Yes, I think that is fair. I would say I want a horse race. I want a horse race where we have family companies, we have non-family companies, the non-family companies are dispersed. I don't know which is the better model. I don't think the evidence is there. My own gut feeling is that the agency costs of dispersed ownership is very high and very difficult to reduce. Where I think it is easier to reduce the private benefits or the problems of misappropriation. And in that sense, I kind of worry about our stock markets. But I would like to see a horse race between different models of ownership and not one wither on the vine like we have in the UK.
And that requires a type of regulation that does not discriminate against one
Yes,
or for the other.
Exactly. It requires a form of regulation that does not discriminate against one, against the other, as I believe our existing system does in the UK.
Any questions? Thank you. There was one, sorry. Yes, go on.
Thank you. And it's first a commentary. Oh, sorry about that. I'm Peter Mølgaard, and I'm a professor at CBS. So I have a question. First a comment, perhaps a little bit. You sort of said that all economists, it sounded like that, were skeptical of private benefits and concentrated ownership. I think, couldn't we agree that it's probably a subset of economists that might have that? So I think many of us like private benefits in many ways, for example. The other thing I wanted to ask you is, are you sure that are you positive that the British system is worse than, for example, the Italian system? In the sense that, can you show that a transit to non-family ownership is harmful for the long-run performance of the firms? That would be very interesting if you could show that. So a little bit, that's what you're saying, right? And you say you have a gut feeling, but is it possible to show that? I mean, do you have any...
To show that the British system is inferior?
Yes.
Okay. The answer is no, I can't prove it. It's very, very hard. These comparative studies are very difficult. And my own gut feel is the British system is probably not inferior to the Italian system because the Italian system has allowed the excesses of the blockholder. They've allowed excesses. I also think families have had strong political connections where they have maybe got more favorable treatment. So I think the comparison is not between Italy and the UK. I don't think that's a fair comparison. Okay. What I think the right comparison is maybe with Scandinavia and the UK. That I think is because in Scandinavia, you've had regulation and culture, which has reduced, if you like, that's my feeling, which has reduced those excesses. There I would like to make the comparison, and I think that would be very helpful. And I'll give you your watch back.
Thank you very much. I've been looking forward to that.
Thank you very much.